You're listening to Tomorrow's Energy, a podcast from Salix.
Coming up in this episode.
If done badly and in the wrong places, heat networks can end up being a very expensive way to heat homes. But obviously there is this possibility that if you do it correctly, you get the capital costs under control, lock on to a really low cost form of heat, then it can be a good deal for consumers.
Welcome to Tomorrow's Energy. I'm Hannah Walker. In this new podcast series, we explore the innovations, technologies, and people driving the energy transition. We'll hear from those at the forefront of change, tackle the biggest challenges, and discover how today's decisions are creating smarter homes, stronger communities, and more sustainable public services for tomorrow. My guest today is Stephen Knight. Welcome to Stephen from the Heat Trust. Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So, Stephen, how are we going to heat whole communities more efficiently? That's the big question.
Well, I think it is a big question. And from a consumer perspective, and I'm a consumer champion, if you like, in the heat network part of this answer. From a consumer perspective, most consumers want heating and hot water to be pretty much invisible. We don't really think about it when we turn on the hot tap, that, a gas boiler's firing up typically somewhere and, burning gas in order to heat that water. It's much less visible, I think, in many ways than when we fill up a car at the petrol pump with petrol. That's something, we have to physically do. We have to put it in, we have to put the petrol into a tank, in order to drive our car around. I think the kind of carbon emissions that we emit through heating our homes and generating the hot water that we rely on for daily life is, as I say, invisible to us. We don't think about it. We really want to think about it very much. We want it to be there reliably, and we don't want it to cost very much. To some extent, because we've had, for many decades now, we've had mains gas pumped from the North Sea at relatively low prices. We haven't had to think about it. Many, UK households have had reliable, low-cost heating, without us doing very much, other than perhaps getting an engineer around to check the boiler once a year. That obviously has to change. The North Sea gas is running out, if nothing else, and clearly we need to cut our carbon emissions. I think it's quite a revolutionary change in terms of how we heat our homes. It's obviously coming up in the next few decades. But I think from a consumer perspective, you still have the same fundamentals. You want it to work. You want it to work reliably. Every time you open the hot tap, you want the water to come out hot. Every time it's cold, you want your radiators to be warm. And you want it to be as low a cost as it can be. Those have got to be the fundamental principles, really, that take us through into how we heat our homes and generate that hot water, I think, in the future.
This is the Tomorrow's Energy podcast with Hannah Walker.
Where do heat networks work best? Where have you seen them work most efficiently?
Well, typically heat networks, are used in urban areas, in cities, in high density developments. That tends to be where we see them most often, although not always. There are new towns in Devon that have been built entirely around district heating. And so, district heating can work anywhere. But fundamentally, I suppose, district heating works particularly well where you've got a low cost source of heat that you can then pump to people's homes. So, for instance, if you've got a power station down the road or a waste incinerator down the road that's pumping out lots of waste heat that would otherwise be either released into the air or, in case of some power stations, dumped into the sea or into a river, then it would make perfect sense to capture that heat and pipe it to people's homes so that we have hot water and we have, warm homes in the winter. And that's the sort of thing which a heat network gives you that option to do. You don't have to generate that heat there, at your home or even at your street corner. You can pipe it in from somewhere where you happen to have lots of waste heat. You can't do that without a heat network.
And tell us about some of those infrastructure challenges, because putting in a heat network it's not simple, is it? It comes with a lot of challenges.
Well, yes, we're used to infrastructure. We've had infrastructure in our roads for, hundreds of years in the UK. We've had water pipes, we've had electricity, we've had gas pipes, all the rest of it. This is a different sort of pipe, if you like. It's typically an insulated pipe because it's carrying hot water. Yes, it does cost money to put things in the ground. And typically when you're building a heat network, the cost of digging the trenches and putting the pipes in is probably the biggest element of that cost. And I think part of the challenge about how we do this in a way that is affordable for consumers is about seeing it as long-term infrastructure in the same way that we've seen these utilities built out in the past. When we're laying cables in the road for electricity, we expect them to last 45 years and we spread that cost over that lifetime. And I think too often these days when we're building heat networks, we want to get at least the developers building them often want a short-term capital return of 8 years for their investors and so on, and that probably isn't going to produce the kind of low-cost infrastructure that we really need. So I think we do need a new way of thinking about how we finance this kind of large-scale infrastructure in the UK.
This is the Tomorrow's Energy podcast.
You've mentioned a couple of times in our conversation the importance of getting the people's bills down, because that is largely what people care about. And we talk about heat networks. Is it a genuine way of getting bills down for the average person? And where do you see the issues? I mean, we you've got companies building heat networks, and as you say, towns being attached to those, hospitals, libraries, town halls, all connected to these heat networks. Are you cautious about it?
I think you've got to be a bit careful. And there have been lots of mistakes made in the past, both in terms of the way in which some of these capital costs have hit consumers, but also we've had a lot of heat networks built over the last few decades, and they've largely relied on communal gas infrastructure. So a lot of big developments, particularly in the capital city in London, with large-scale gas boilers, gas combined heat and power engines generating electricity and heat. Often when these were planned, commercial gas costs were really low. This was pre-COVID, pre-energy crisis, pre-war in Ukraine. Gas prices were very low, and therefore this was a really low-cost way of heating these developments. What we've seen since then is commercial gas prices very much higher than they used to be, much more volatile. And therefore, the cost of transporting the heat from these energy centres to consumers, when you start with a much higher cost product in terms of the heat generation, because the gas is so much more expensive, you then got the cost of transporting it, both in terms of the capital cost of building the infrastructure, but also you tend to lose quite a bit of heat in transit. So those costs have ended up making it quite an expensive proposition for many consumers, and we see that quite often. And that's partly, as I say, from the fact that heat source, which started off as a low-cost heat proposition, is no longer necessarily a low-cost heat proposition. Partly because we've not had proper regulation in this space. We have also had a lot of heat networks built that haven't been designed or installed or maintained efficiently. Heat losses have been bigger than they need to be. Therefore, costs have crept up for those reasons as well. I think if done badly and in the wrong places, heat networks can end up being a very expensive way to heat homes. But obviously, there is this possibility that if you do it correctly, you get the capital costs under control. In terms of the way they're financed, you lock on to a really low-cost form of heat, then it can be a good deal for consumers. And critically, if we're going to decarbonise our cities in the future, it's going to be almost impossible to do it without heat networks. If you imagine everybody having their own heat pump, if we could, if you like, flick our fingers today and every home in the UK had its own heat pump, what would be the result? Well, the result would be that our electricity system simply wouldn't cope with the demand for electricity on the coldest days. And so we have to have a different way of shifting the load of heating and a different way of supplying heat that we aren't having to generate electrically, if you like, certainly not electrically at peak demand times. Okay. And heat networks give us that opportunity.
Thank you for listening to Tomorrow's Energy, and a big thank you to Stephen Knight. Don't forget to look out for our next episode and join us as we continue exploring the ideas, innovations, and people sharing our energy transition. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe to our channels and consider listening to our sister podcast, The Decarbonisation Dialogue. Any thoughts, email us at podcast@salixfinance.co.uk. A big thanks once again to Stephen Knight from the Heap Trust.
My pleasure.
You've been listening to Tomorrow's Energy, a podcast from Salix. For information about our work and more content, visit salixfinance.co.uk/podcasts.